Okay, good afternoon, people, and welcome to today's installment. I will be addressing Chapter 5 in this terrific book by William Chittick, which is called The Science of the Cosmos, Science of the Soul. Okay, Chapter 5, the title is The Unseen Men. And it opens with a presentation of what I imagine to be like a fairly well-known myth in the Islamic tradition. And it's a story about an invisible group of people. I presume they were Sufi masters who became enlightened, and now they play some sort of mystical role as sort of overseers of the collective consciousness. And it's, kind of interesting, but didn't really grab me per se. And then Chittick pays homage to a contemporary Islamic scholar named Seyyed Hossin Nasr, who I'm not familiar with. So I'm going to just pick up with what I've written as, my summary for Chapter 5. And now this is me just sort of paraphrasing. Okay, Chapter 5 begins on page 75. Okay, so this section opens with a lengthy homage to Nasr and the Islamic intellectual heritage and its importance to the overall spiritual state of humanity. I am unfamiliar with Nasr. I concur with the premise that intellectual focus of even a small number of people can have a major impact on collective consciousness in general. Chittick states in this chapter that he will present a reformulation of Nasr's traditional Islamic worldview. Nasr is an advocate of traditionalism or perennialism, which is a school of philosophy that proposes that a single primordial metaphysical truth forms the source for and is shared by all major religions. Okay, perennialism. Okay. So there's a discussion of Nasr's advocacy of Sufism beginning on page 79. Nasr is an advocate of the relevance of Sufism to contemporary situation. Unfortunately, the Sufi approach is highly disparaged by today's Muslim community. Sufism's association with the term esoteric is part of its being suspect because esotericism has associations with the occult. It would be more helpful to associate Sufism with the inner teachings of Islam and distance it from esotericism, which makes people nervous because of the occultic association. And this happens with Christianity as well. If you call Swedenborg's teachings esoteric, then traditional or fundamental Christians will say esoteric. That's the occult, so stay away. So yeah, that's not a very helpful term these days. It's kind of got some boogeyman associations. So Sufism is the doorway to the inner level of understanding of Islam, the same way that Swedenborg's interpretations present the inner understanding of Christianity. Subsection titled Cosmos and Soul begins on page 82. And I paraphrase, in traditional Islam, it is impossible to disconnect the human soul from the cosmos. But this statement also applies to traditional Judeo-Christian cosmology as well. All three are founded on this statement: man is created in the image of God, which simply restated could be said the cosmos is the image of God, because man is created in the cosmos, and the cosmos represents the divine, the image of God. So obviously, the modern scientific paradigm, which is the dominant popular mindset in our current society, is not in agreement with this sort of cosmology that associates the cosmos with representing the divine. Okay, now naming reality on page 84, I paraphrase. How we define what we are experiencing is absolutely critical to the outcome of our experience. It is the right of human beings to determine what things mean to us. Our personal reality is subjective. However, we may be delusional. Modern science proclaims that we live in an impersonal, mechanistic universe that is cold and uncaring. Whereas the traditional Islamic view is that the divine mercy holds all of us together, and our fate is in his infinitely loving and wise hands at all times. And obviously those two views are diametrically opposed to one another. Okay, so now I'm going to present a lengthy quote from this section, which is titled The Naming of Reality. Okay, so I'm quoting Chittick. The Quran states that God taught Adam all the names. And this is a verse that epitomizes Islam's theology, cosmology, and spiritual psychology. It alerts us to the three basic realities that must be taken into account if we are to understand the nature of things. 1, God; 2, the cosmos; and 3, the human soul. God taught the names of all of these to human beings at their origin. The names are not divorced from the meanings, which are the realities that are represented by the names. The names were the perfect expression of Adam's realization of all the knowledge in the depth of his soul. So Adam being taught all of the divine names implies that at creation we are given an a priori perception or connection to the true meaning of all things. Okay. As the first prophet, Adam is the primordial recipient of divine guidance and the leader of all his children on the road to salvation and realization. If his children are to deal with the cosmos properly and appropriately according to the hack of things, which is their innate essential truth, and if they are to actualize the fullness of their own nature, they need to understand the names revealed to their Father and act accordingly. Human beings will always name things. Human rationality is articulate, uttered, spoken, and proper human speech is intelligent and rational. In the Islamic worldview, the full actualization of this spoken, articulate rationality presupposes knowledge of the real names of things. Knowing the real names means knowing things in the context of God's knowledge of them, which only comes to us when He Himself names them for us. If people fail to name things under the wing of divine guidance, they will name them as they see fit. There is no possible way, however, for them to know the real name of things without assistance from the divine namer, because the real names are the reality of things in the divine mind. God gives existence to the things according to their names, and understanding the real names is the key to understanding the cosmos and the soul. A worldview that leaves out the divine dimension will necessarily deal with inadequate names, if not misnomers. The net result of misguided naming will be disaster for those who employ the misguided names. And that disaster is understood by Islam to extend into the upper realms. Okay, it's not just disaster that occurs on the natural level, but what occurs on the natural level impacts the higher levels of reality. To understand why modern scientific cosmology appears to the intellectual traditions as enormously truncated, it is sufficient to meditate on the names that science gives to the really significant things, mysterious principles or realities that determine the configuration of the real world. What happens when the important names are quasars, quarks, muons, black holes, and big bangs? What is the psychological and spiritual fruit of naming ultimate things with mathematical formulas? Islamic cosmology begins with the knowledge that the universe holds the key to the immortality of our souls. It views the cosmos as instilled with meaning and purpose. It names the one origin of the cosmos with a variety of names derived from the divine self-naming. And none of these names is abstract or inhuman. The Islamic God is anthropomorphic because the Islamic human is theomorphic. If God is understood in man's image, it is because man was created in God's image. And unless God is understood in human terms, a yawning gap will remain between the ultimate and the here and now. Religio, or tying back to God, is impossible without images of God and imagining God. People need to take an active role in tying themselves back to God, and they can only do so in terms of themselves and their own understanding. They can understand only what they are. If they do not display the traces of the divine in some way, they cannot tie themselves back to the divinity. People who live in a traditional anthropomorphic universe will necessarily deal with it in human terms. Those who live in an abstract universe will deal with things and others as abstractions. And those who live in a mechanistic universe will treat everything as a machine. Those who find the universe cold and uncaring will reciprocate. Okay, now this is my statement. There's a range of thinking about transcendence versus eminence of God, which means God being above and beyond and outside of creation, and eminence meaning his presence within creation. So there's a range of thought about this amongst traditional Islamic philosophers. Some advocate the absolute transcendence of God. Arabi stands on the razor's edge between these two, saying that rationality speaks of transcendence, but the mythic imagination perceives God's eminence. And we must embrace both perspectives simultaneously. But all Islamic philosophers agree that no matter what happens in our experience, we need to assume a humble attitude and trust God's wisdom in every situation, even if his purpose remains a mystery on some level. Okay, the next section is titled The One and the Many, and it is found on page 90. Here's a quote. Although the one God in himself cannot be known, his manifestations cannot be avoided, so much so that from a certain point of view, nothing can be known but God. However, knowledge of the one's infinitely diverse manifestations is infinitely diverse, which is to say that God is known through the many as well as through oneness. Knowledge that clings to the data of sense perceptions is limited to the surface, and all the terms that science employs should be understood as metaphors, not as literal scientific designations. God can only be truly known inasmuch as he names himself, and those divinely taught names have everything to do with our understanding of how the universe comes into existence. Some of the divine names, which are all describing his attributes, are alive, all-knowing, desiring, powerful, existing, being, consciousness, and joy. According to Islam, these are all attributes of God. So manifestation begins with first two-ness and then gradually differentiates into various cosmic levels. Being is one Manifestation marks the boundary between the divine and the world. Here's a quote. God is utterly real and the world utterly unreal. But from another standpoint, the world has a relative reality when compared to non-existence. This relative reality derives from God. Inasmuch as we emphasize God's reality and the world's unreality, we conceive of it in terms of otherness. Inasmuch as we conceive of God as giving rise to the world through his activities and attributes, we conceive of God and the world in terms of unfathomable sameness. In other words, God is both transcendent and immanent. In terms of God's transcendence, the world is nothing. In terms of his immanence, it is something because it displays the attributes and qualities that he bestows upon it. True life and consciousness belong to God alone, and everything else, strictly speaking, is dead. But once we note the divine life in cosmic signs, we see that everything is alive and aware to some degree. The subsection titled The Living Universe is on page 92. Here's a quote. From the point of view of Islamic cosmology, what we call science is a reading of the universe that ignores all but the most insignificant meanings of the cosmos. When the universe is named by names that apply primarily to dead things or machines or to impersonal processes, we will understand it in terms of death and mechanism and impersonal process. We will necessarily miss the significance of life, mercy, and awareness, which is present in every atom. Islamic science is the heading of the subsection that begins on page 94, but this entire subsection was hard for me to figure out, so I kind of just skip it, and that marks the end of chapter 5. The final 15 pages of that section had some pretty, interesting statements, but I couldn't really sew it all together into a coherent summary, so I'm just gonna let it go, and if you get the book, you can read it for yourself. Okay, so that wraps up chapter 5 in a mere 19 minutes. All right, so I hope you found that interesting, and the next video will be addressing chapter 6, the title of which is The Anthropocosmic Vision. All right, well, thanks, and I'll see you next time.